We're going to start on page Shin Samach Hey in the Zera Shimshon for Parshas Vayeshev. So on page Shin Samach Hey, which is a Siman Vav, he quotes the verse Pasuk Nasu Mizeh. The brothers have gone away, have traveled away from this. And that's a difficult word because the word should be from here or from this place. Nasu mizeh means they left this. What's this? Pirush Rashi. So Rashi explains, Hesiu atzman min ha'achva. They've traveled, they've distanced themselves away from the brotherhood. In other words, this angel, this man who Yosef meets, is warning Yosef that the brothers, page Shin Samach Hey, that the brothers have traveled away. They no longer see themselves as your brothers. Okay, so we're going to now take this and we're going to move into the left paragraph where the word Va'amar. Va'amar Hesiu atzman min ha'achva. Why did the brothers remove themselves from the brotherhood? What does that even mean? How do they remove themselves and no longer see Yosef as a brother? So he says, Shahayel shedanu osu k'bal machlokas. Since they saw him as a bal machlokas, someone who is constantly fighting and quarreling and never getting along, imkain eino achehem, then they understood that it must be that he isn't their brother. How does that work? So he says that Beperik Dalad the Kiddushin, the Gemara tells us in Masechtas Kiddushin, Shtikusa Hainu Yichusa. Silence is a sign of lineage, of what's the better word, of pedigree. If someone is a silent, lets things go, doesn't talk up, doesn't make a big deal about things, that's a sign of good lineage. Someone who's constantly fighting, picking fights and quarreling, such a person, and therefore if you see two families at war with each other, one of them is probably a disqualified and unfit family, or maybe both of them. Because fighting comes from people who have some blemish in their lineage. It might be that someone married someone they weren't supposed to be. There might be that there was a child born from a marriage that wasn't supposed to happen. There might even be the level of mamzerus or something like that, because that's where fighting comes from. So they argued, or reasoned, if they're really brothers, then they couldn't have looked at him as the perspective of treating him as someone who's just causing divisiveness in the family. Because if they are brothers and they are spiritually refined and good, then they should have seen him the same way. But so for Lishtok, and in which case they should have recognized that he's not a person who likes to fight, and then they should just wait for him to get over his issues.
Just with the father?
Well, we'll see. He's going to break that down. Elavada Tzarech Lomar. So since they did treat him as someone who is in such a far state of machlokas that he's irredeemable. Sarach Loma, therefore, you have to say that they separated themselves from recognizing him as a brother. They no longer included him, the brother. That's the only way to justify the claim that they were making. So that's step one. Step one is he's saying that the brothers must have seen Yosef as someone who was, and put into simple terms, somehow illegitimate. Because if he was of the same pedigree as they were, it is impossible that they, who had such perfect lineage, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, should find themselves as Balei Machlokas, as people who are just constantly at each other's throats. And if it is that way, it must be that at least one side has improper lineage. How does that work? So he's going to explain that.
Just a comment, just from what the shot of the Torah, it didn't seem like Joseph was so much arguing with the brothers. It's just that there was a jealousy.
Right, but even if you see the dreams and the fighting and the fact that he's instigating and inciting them, even without getting into the midrashim, but the fact that he's taking bad tidings to their father and causing hatred that way, that's all signs of someone who's looking to cause divisiveness, and that's an attribute of someone who's of inappropriate lineage.
Their uncles fought. I mean, Eitzav and
Yeah.
Yaakov, so
well, let's see how
they were
he's.
brothers still?
We haven't seen yet how he explains the improper lineage. We'll see about that.
So is that true today also? Is that true that if there's
Yes.
fighting within families, it's because
Somewhere in there, someone illegitimate got mixed in. So he says, "V'im tomar." So the question is, but the biggest insult here to accuse Yosef of having bad lineage is to accuse their father. Because you would have to say that the father had some kind of inappropriate relationship in order to allow for there to be some illegitimacy. So the answer is, he's very clear about it. So I'd like to explain this based on the words of the Ramban in Parshas Toldos, who says, "Shatam shalakach Yaakov shtei achayos." Why was Yaakov allowed to marry two sisters when that is a biblical prohibition? That is something which is not allowed, and our forefathers could already foresee the mitzvahs that would be in the Torah, especially the ones that are negative prohibitions. And the Ramban explains, "Mishum mitzvahs lo nitztava rak be'eretz Yisrael." At least before the giving of the Torah, the mitzvahs only applied in Eretz Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu nikra Elokei haaretz. At that point, Hashem was called the God of the land. This is all the Ramban. This is not the Zera Shimshon. But outside of Eretz Yisrael, Hanagasa al Yidei Sarim. God rules the world through the agents, the ministers in charge of each country. And therefore, at least at that time, the laws of the Torah did not apply to the Avos when they were in Chutz La'aretz. That's what the Ramban says in Parshas Toldos to explain why Yaakov marries two sisters. V'af heim hayu omrim. So the brothers reasoned like this. B'vadai hayel shehu ba'al machlokas shemetz pisul yeshbo. Now we were not going to assume that there's something wrong with Yosef. We were never going to go there. But we see that he's constantly fighting and quarreling and causing trouble. So there must be some blemish there. The Afal Pisha Yaakov lo chata klal. It's not that Yaakov sinned. Yaakov did nothing wrong, because at the time that he had relations with Rachel, they were living outside of Eretz Yisrael. As soon as they arrive in Eretz Yisrael, what happens to Rachel? She dies. According to the Ramban, she dies because as soon as they enter Eretz Yisrael, that's no longer a legitimate marriage. So therefore, Yaakov did nothing wrong because his relationship was outside Eretz Yisrael. Mikal Makam hu nolad mibia she'enu mutares ba'aretz. But once they arrive in Eretz Yisrael, Yosef is now retroactively born of an illegitimate relationship. This is fascinating. Yaakov and Rachel did nothing wrong because all the relationships they had were in Chutz La'aretz. But once they arrive in Eretz Yisrael, Yosef, who is now in Eretz Yisrael, the result of a marriage between a man and two sisters, that in Eretz Yisrael carries this blemish with Yosef. Meaning, as long as Yosef was outside this, and that's where they arrive in Eretz Yisrael, that's where divisiveness begins.
Would that mean Binyamin had the blemish too then?
We'd have to say that, right?
Yeah, but they didn't seem to fight with Benjamin.
Well, I guess you would say he's still too young, and in theory they were arguing that when Binyamin comes of age, that he's going to have the same issue. At least that's what they're thinking. He says, Dumya the Kohen, Shenasa Gerusha, the halacha is that a Kohen who is not allowed to marry a divorcee, if he marries a divorcee, Shehu mechul al ba ba'oda imo. So he is considered a illegitimate kohen as long as he's married to a divorcee. He can't duchen. He certainly can't do the service in the Beis Hamikdash. Me'emesa or girsha, but as soon as either she dies or he divorces her, who nishar b'kedusha, so he goes back to being a perfectly legitimate kohen. But the child born of that relationship, halal, remains an illegitimate kohen. So you can see that even though the father is not considered to have that blemish, but the child can still carry that blemish. And therefore he's using that as a proof to suggest that the brothers were reasoning that while Yosef, when they arrived in Eretz Yisrael, even though Yaakov and Rachel have done nothing wrong, Yosef still carries the blemish. V'asi shaper, and therefore it comes out good. Page Shin Samach Vav. Av tchilas haparsha. Now the beginning of the parsha makes sense too. It says Vayeshev Yaakov. Yaakov dwelt be'eretz Canaan, in the land of Canaan. Meaning the Torah is explaining to you what the brothers are thinking. Kashiyasha Yaakov be'eretz, only because Yaakov had moved to Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, as Eila told us Yaakov Yosef, that's why the whole story of Yosef happens. Torah is giving you a clue. You should know that had they stayed in the Chutz La'aretz, none of these issues would have come up. Because as soon as he arrives in Eretz Yisrael, now the judgments come down and say, Isur shtei achayos, you marry two sisters. She Yosef bar mirachel. And that's why the Torah says, V'la yachlu dabro l'shalom, they couldn't speak peacefully to Yosef. Lo hayicholim lomar lo lech l'shalom, they couldn't even say to him, and greet him, and wish him well, kidei sheyatzliach b'masav, that he should have success. They couldn't wish him success. You know why? Because his goal is to create divisiveness. And success on the part of Yosef, if they would have said shalom to him, shalom would have mean you should have success. That would have means they would have wished him for success in his desire to cause fighting. He can't succeed. He's a person of quarreling. We find by the generation of David, they were great righteous people in the days of David, but they used to go to war and they had many casualties. Because they were people who fought a lot. The Shekhinah does not rest in them.
Is this the idea of the Zera Shimshon, or is this is this something that's truly we believe happens?
Which part? That
or is this, what I meant, is this just something that was in the brother's head, or was it something?
Well, he's saying this is in the brother's head. Although we'll see in the next line there might be some element of truth in it. But certainly this is what they are thinking.
They're thinking, but does Zera Shimshon agree with that? I mean, to say that this is a truth.
Well, let's see the next paragraph, and you'll tell me if he answers that question, because he might.
Does this go along with the idea that some have about the Dibatam Ra'ah was over the brothers thinking that the laws of Eretz Canaan or Israel would apply, and he thought they would not in terms of Abram and Achai, that a Jew could...
Well, it's the other way. He thought that they did apply, and they thought that the rules didn't.
So that goes against...
Well, yeah, I mean, you can argue both ways. There's a question, well, they might have thought they had a din of Yisrael, and therefore they ate it afterwards. Yeah, you could tie that all in. But here comes the biggest chiddush of the Zera Shimshon. You gotta, put on your seatbelt for this next line. Ve'efshar nami shemitam zeh Yosef halach l'Mitzrayim. That's why Yosef only survives by getting out of Eretz Yisrael. Spends the rest of his life in Egypt. V'nimkar sham v'lo shav od la'aretz ela acha misaso, and he only returns to Eretz Yisrael after his death. Because, and that's why I was saying it's not so clear whether Zera Shimshon agrees with it, it almost sounds like he's saying there is some truth to it, which is why God himself, and this is why he gets sold down to Egypt, because as long as he's in Eretz Yisrael, there is this issue with his legitimacy.
But this is before they got the Torah, so how did they assume that he's illegitimate at this point.
Well, that's what we mentioned before, that our sages understood that our forefathers who were prophets foresaw some of the basic elements of the Torah. Certainly a prohibition of the improper marriage.
Was Shem before Yosef was born? The massacre?
No. Yosef was born in the house of Lavan. But Yosef at that time was 7 years old at the time of Shem.
So because they had a perfect battle then, and afterwards there's a midrash about the battling all the kings that when they came back.
Right.
Yosef was part of that.
Right.
They had success then. How could he be a Baal Machlokes if they would have?
Well, like the question with Binyamin first. It seems like Baal Machlokes starts after a certain element comes out.
Benjamin was born in the land of Israel.
Right. Right. It's interesting because Binyamin you should think would be even worse because he lived his entire life until they go down.
Is he
But-
suggesting that the brothers sold him out to Mitzrayim to somehow legitimize him?
Right, that's what you could almost say that. Like the brothers understood that they need to sell him
To get him
out of Eretz Yisrael to solve both problems.
I don't think that would hold up in their trial.
Right? No, but this is an incredible explanation. He's saying that Yosef needs to be outside Eretz Yisrael, and then he'll be fixed. He won't be illegitimate outside Eretz Yisrael, and you'll solve all the problems. Just get him out of the country.
Is it the same concept that if somebody knows he's a mamzer, if he goes to Saudi Arabia, sell himself as a slave for a few years and get released, then he's no longer a mamzer?
Something like that. You could connect that too.
Is that true? What?
Well, he's not a mamzer, but his kids will. Won't be mamzerim. A mamzer's children are mamzerim, and their children's are mamzerim forever and ever. There is a process that the Gemara mentions that a person can fix themselves, but not themselves, but their children. It's a very interesting thing. A Jew cannot marry a non-Jew. There's one exception for when a Jew is allowed to lekatchila marry a non-Jew. What's the case? If a Jew is an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, a Jewish bondsman, his master is allowed to give him a non-Jewish maidservant as a wife. Those children that he has are his children, but they are goyim, out of a legitimate marriage. And then his children, if they should ever convert, would be regular perfect Jews, and even without that, they're half-Jews being slaves of a Jew. So that's, the Gemara says, the only way that a mamzer can have kosher children is to be sold into slavery, marry a non-Jewish woman that way, and the children can then be kosher. Right. Right. But otherwise, anytime he has a child with a non-Jew, his children are not mamzerim. But that's an illegitimate marriage. Here you have lekatchila. He's allowed to marry. There's no issues with it. Anyway, and now he explains to us something which may have bothered some of you. We always talk about Yosef's bones coming up to...
Yeah.
You ever bothered by the fact that why is it just Yosef's bones? Don't we say that tzaddikim, their bodies remain intact and they don't decay, they don't rot? So why are they bringing up a casket filled with bones? And the Torah never says anything other than atzmos Yosef, the bones of Yosef. V'kasha, lama la nikbar sham gufa kumo Yaakov. Why doesn't he merit that his body should be buried there, just like Yaakov?
Wasn't he embalmed by the Egyptians?
You would think he should stay fresh.
He was embalmed, though.
Right, but nevertheless, it was just the bones.
Okay.
That's the question. Why does the Torah say the bones? V'yeshloma, the answer is, unbelievable pshat from the Zera Shimshon. The Bepera Gimel the Nida, the Gemara tells us in Masechtas Nida, Amrinan, Tanu Rabbanan, Shlosha Shutafin Yesh Ba'adam, there's 3 partners in every person. Aviv, the father, now I don't know if this works biologically, but certainly on the spiritual level this is the way it works. The father who produces the seed, Mazriya Loven, he produces the aspect of the white. Shimimanu, therefore from him comes Moach, the brain, Gidin, the sinews, Atzamos, and the bones. whether it's physical or even spiritual, but the father is seen as the producer of the brains, the sinews, and the bones. The isha mezaras odem, while the woman produces the red, shmenu or ubasa v'saros, which is the skin, the flesh, and the hair, v'chulu, etc. Ad kam l'shah. That's what the Gemara says. Elafisha ra Yosef. So when Yosef saw shemitchila k'shahayadar ba'aretz, when he's living in Eretz Yisrael, nisorer alav isur shtei achayos. So now he's saying it's not just the brothers who saw this, but Yosef who realizes this. He understands the claim that they have against him. They're saying, you're born in Eretz Yisrael, you are now the child of two sisters. Vayiru Achav, and the brothers saw, and he had to leave to Chutz La'aretz, v'lo shav od ladur sham, and he never returns to live in Eretz Yisrael. And he understands, v'af Rachel Mesa, and he knows that Rachel dies, miyad shenichnas al haaretz, as soon as they enter Eretz Yisrael. V'sham nikbara b'derech, she was buried on the road. V'lo yigia li'kaver b'shum ir me'arei Eretz Yisrael, she never got to be buried in any city in Eretz Yisrael. K'ma shekasav ara'im b'parshas Vayechi ayin sham. So he understood that there's a complaint here against his mother.
So Bethlehem, like the Arab says, okay, it's not Israel, it's there.
What do you mean?
Where she's buried.
She's buried in there.
It's not in a city in Eretz Yisrael.
Huh?
They built a city around it later, but at that point there's no city. It was in the middle of the road.
Side of the road.
But it was part of Eretz Yisrael, right?
Yeah, but it wasn't. That's what he's saying. It was in Eretz Yisrael, but it wasn't a city in Eretz Yisrael.
But she wasn't even buried in Machpelah.
There was no Beis Lachem. Yeah, it is Beis Lachem, but there was no Beis Lachem then.
Only the bones can come back.
Sure it is, but they're
Then also, that's why from
The fact that you can say she wasn't buried in Machpelah.
Right.
Clever.
Right.
So Ephraim and Menashe are okay because he was in prison. Based upon what he said, you can get out of being by being in prison a certain amount of time. So he was an Eved, and he. So
Well, you have to know because she's a Jew. She was born a Jew.
But him.
Yeah, but his wife. It's about the wife. It's not
So
about
she
him.
was always.
Right, I don't know. You have to think about that. He says, "Shemachi lo amar va'alisem es atzmosai." So he knows that whatever he got from his mother is not going up to Eretz Yisrael, and so therefore he understood that even with the embalming, his flesh was going to deteriorate. Shezeu chelik avi, only his father's contribution. Thank you. Is going to go up to Eretz Yisrael. Achalo haguf, but not the body. Shehaor ubasar hu achelik shel imo, because whatever is related to his mother is not going to make it to Eretz Yisrael. Again, an incredible pshat. It helps answer. He goes on. We're going to stop here because I want to get to Chanukah. But again, he's answering so many questions here. First of all, that the issues with Yosef, it sounds like the brothers agreed to this, and Yosef sensed this, and as we'll say soon, that it could be Yaakov recognized that later too. That as soon as he comes into Eretz Yisrael, Rachel dies. As soon as Yosef is around and there's fighting amongst the brothers, that seems to be a result of some blemish within the family. And Yehuda says, what are we going to gain if we kill him? Let's sell him, and then everything will be resolved. All the problems will be resolved. Without, Yosef will be outside of Eretz Yisrael. Spiritually, he won't be blemished. He'll be in a better place. We'll be in a better place. Everything makes sense. And even Yosef recognizes this in the end and says, I guess they're right, because I'm not even expecting, and as it turns out, he's right, that only his bones get taken up there.
So why bother embalming? If he knows saints don't deteriorate, and why...
Well, the Egyptians do what they do. You can't give instructions counter to what they're going to do, right?
He was making a point.
Just a note about why, Rabbi?
Well, he's saying the bones are okay because the bones are his part of Yaakov.
He's not illegitimate when they bury him.
Right, the bones are not illegitimate, just his flesh is illegitimate.
Yeah, no, the other thing is that all Yaakov's sons married people that probably weren't Jewish because they have to marry outside, outside
they married
the family.
sisters.
Or they married sisters, but we do find Yehuda married a Canaanite,
Yes.
but he didn't have good children with that wife. Only when he married Tamar did he have good children. So you have the Midrashim say they married their sisters from the other mother and things like that, and that kind of thing. But the simple reading of the Torah, as someone suggests, is they married, but they converted them somehow into the family.
Right, but that's what I would assume that they would, that most of the wives would have been converted.
Where is the rest of the Shabbatim buried?
Most of them are buried in Eretz Yisrael. I think maybe all of them. There's different places in Eretz Yisrael.
All of them, the place and the
You mean they brought back? You mean they brought back all the?
Yeah, that's what the Medrash tells us, that all the brothers...
They buried them there, so they didn't have to take anybody. The same
Yes.
thing they did with
Eh,
Yaakov.
They know where it's all of them.
The children of Yosef,
Have you ever visited?
Ephraim
It's in Israel, but
and
some of the Arab
Menashe.
territories.
Right.
When we bless our kids, we bless them with Ephraim and Menashe. So the blessing.
No. There's no mamzerim here. Right. There's a blemish. There's a blemish within, because Yaakov was allowed to marry two sisters. He was in Chutz La'aretz. But they're just saying that some blemish remains behind even when they come into Eretz Yisrael. But it's certainly not going to carry on. That's what someone was saying before about Yosef, being whatever. It's not going to carry on into his descendants somehow, especially since Yosef was removed and taken out of Eretz Yisrael.
But he married Potiphar's wife.
The daughter.
His daughter.
Daughter. Who
Right.
was Dina's
No. So if you don't learn like that Medrash, and you learn that it was literally the daughter of Potiphar, then certainly the children are fixed.
Potiphar was a eunuch, according to the Medrash.
Well, according to one Medrash, he became a eunuch after he bought Yosef. So there's a Medrash like
Okay.
that. And because he had bought Yosef for improper reasons, so
He was a Jewish slave that wasn't a slave of another Jew. That's what you say, if they can marry.
no, that's once the Torah is given. But the truth is, any time a mamzer would have children with a non-Jewess, those children would be non-Jews, and if they convert, would be perfectly legitimate children. That's true always. So if he married a non-Jew, assuming that she wasn't wasn't the daughter of Dinah, if she really was a non-Jew, then without question, Yosef's children would be perfectly legitimate.
I want to just say what that Medrash is about Dinah, because not everyone here obviously knows that Medrash.
Right, although I'm running low on time, but there is a Medrash that says that the daughter of Dinah and Shechem, of that relationship, was sent down to Egypt and adopted by Potiphar, and ends up becoming with the whole story. Maybe if we have time, we'll share it. But right, the amulet which sat on the daughter of Yaakov. Yeah, it's a great story. But
So in this day and age, the same thing you can do, like a mamzer can marry a non-Jew. And then,
well, he couldn't. But if he would, the children would be legitimate.
what do you mean he couldn't?
A mamzer is not allowed to marry a non-Jew.
You mean just because anybody's not allowed to?
Right, just like any Jew is not allowed to marry a non-Jew.
Okay, well,
That's
let's say-
why the whole slavery thing is. And I should tell you that there's a tshuva from Reb Moshe Feinstein where he discusses the halachic. I'm going to be very gentle with this possibility of a non-Jew, a non-Jewish woman who's in the process of conversion, whether she's allowed to sell herself into a theoretical slavery in order to marry, and for another Jew to buy another Jew as an Eved Ivri, halachically, in order to allow that marriage to fix the children of mamzerim. Whether you could do such a fictional marriage, meaning it's a legitimate marriage, a real marriage, but he should sell himself to another Jew as an Eved Ivri, and she should sell herself to a Jew as an Eved Kanani before her conversion, as a Shivcha Kananis.
Wow.
And Reb Moshe Feinstein deals with this issue from a halachic perspective, discussing the question of whether a Jew is allowed to, even for theoretical purposes, buy a slave woman after all slavery has been outlawed in the United States, whether or not that's considered going against Dina de Malchusa Dina, a fascinating question, against the laws of the land, even though there isn't actual slavery here, we're just doing it for the sake of an official purpose, Reb Moshe deals with this question. He ends up saying that since the government would not find a problem with someone doing this only for the sake of being called a slave, but it's the action of slavery which is prohibited, and not the name slavery, that's not against the law, therefore he allows such a process to go through. But if you think this is Rav Moshe Feinstein judging the signature of Abraham Lincoln on a document as to what exactly is meant by the outlawing of slavery. Yeah. Yes.
But it's also the 13th and 14th Amendment of the Constitution.
Right, but the question is, what is meant by that? Is slavery outlawed, or is the name? Anyway, the fascinating issue. Okay, moving on to page Shin Pei Zion. Again, if someone has to leave, I understand. We're going to go a little longer because we started a bit later, but Shin Pei Zion. We're just going to do this page. He has more on Chanukah than this, what we're going to do, but we'll save some for next week as well. Okay. Persume nisa adiflan lakdume. I want to talk about the miracle of Chanukah first, before I talk about the parsha, is what he's saying. The story of Chanukah is very much related to the story of the sale of Yosef. Which is why Parshas Miketz always falls on Chanukah. So, what's the connection? So he goes straight to it. Rabbi Nassan Shapiro, called known by his sefer Megala Amukas, which literally means he who reveals the depths, because he pulls out information that there's no one else in the world that could have pulled out. Just says incredible stuff. And he quotes him here. He says, Az b'yemei Yavan, during the days of the Greeks, Nischadesh avon mechiras Yosef, is when the sin of the sale of Yosef was awakened. Somehow, the prosecution against us was awakened. V'zehu, ready for this? Antiochus is the exact numerical value of 156. Ola begematria Yosef, the same numerical value as Yosef. Antiochus and Yosef are both 156. V'chein melech Yavan, 156. Gematria Yosef. Yosef is the same numerical value as Antiochus and the same numerical value as Melech Yavan. Because this was a complaint against us that we sold Yosef, and this, whenever there's a prosecution against us for a certain sin, it awakens a prosecution against us, which came up in the form of a king called Antiochus, who was the king of Yavan, who were meant to represent the prosecution against us for the sale of Yosef. That's why they wanted all the Jews to write Al Keren Hashor on the horn of the ox. She'ein lam chelik, that we have no portion. Very strange thing. They decreed that we should all write on the horns of the oxen that we have no portion in God. And all the commentaries like, what a strange thing to do. Write it on your doors, write it on your walls, write it on your foreheads, write it on the horn of an ox. The answer is because God is sending us a message. It's about Yosef, who is the ox. And he says, "Va'az haya b'shnas reish yud gimel lebinyan bayis sheni." The story of Chanukah happened 213 years into the second temple. V'zeh ma sheramaz Lavan liYaakov, and Lavan tells Yaakov about this. Lavan called that place Yegar Sahadusa, which is the mound of testimony. Yagar Yud Gimel Reish, Begematria Reish Yud Gimel. Lavan was saying to him, here's this little mound here. I know exactly what's coming up against you. Watch out for 213. Because 213 is when this prosecution is going to come. Wow. So he says, so why was it the 213th year? Yeshlomar the Isa Bezoar Parshas Vayeshev, the Zohar tells us, Shegalus Mitzrayim Hava Ba'avon Mechiras Yosef. That's an obvious one. Everyone knows this. That the sin of selling Yosef, that most directly led to the Egyptian exile. Yosef got sold into slavery, the Jews were dragged down there, and they stayed there, and as we know, clearly, that's one of the issues against the Jewish people is the sale of Yosef. V'odamru, Shekashiyatzu Yisrael Me Mitzrayim, Nasan lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu HaShabbos. When the Jews come out of Egypt, they get Shabbos. Shehu midaso shel Yosef sheyichaper al chatasam. So Yosef is related to Shabbos. So it was actually connected to what we were discussing yesterday, that we say the 7 shepherds are related to the 7 Yamim Tovim. So Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot are Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Purim and Chanukah are Moshe and Aaron. And Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh are Yosef and David. So Yosef is related to Shabbos. So we couldn't really have the Shabbos until we had been fixed on the level of Yosef, for the sin of Yosef. And that, when they came out and their sin was atoned, and it says, and when they stopped keeping Shabbos, as the verse in Yirmiyah says, Vayeshev b'shari Yerushalayim, nigzer aleim galus bavel, that's when they went into exile. So they went into exile for not keeping Shabbos. Then they come back and they build the second temple and they work very hard on keeping Shabbos. Everyone knows that's when Ezra comes back and sees them doing business on Shabbos, and that's where they made all these extra decrees against Shabbos. Muktzah came at that time, all these new things. When they rebuilt the second base of English, there's so much emphasis on the observance of Shabbos because they understood that was one of the reasons why they went into exile. But then, when we finally resolved one problem with Yosef, which was Shabbos, why was the second temple destroyed? Sinas Chinam. That's the real sin of Yosef. Right? The whole thing is Sinas Chinam. Also, they hated him. So, therefore, again, this is unbelievable. He's saying that the sin of Yosef is being carried along with us all the time. As long as we don't repeat the sins of Yosef, we can stay in Eretz Yisrael. We can stay with the Holy Temple. As soon as we, as a people, started hating each other, we started causing machlokas between ourselves, we lost this power. That's where the Greeks took over. So I think the reason why it was the 213th year, Ki Riv Humariva Reish Yud Beis. Reish Yud Beis is the word Riv, means machlokas.
Right.
Al Riv b'nei Yisrael, v'Riv gematria Reish Yud Beis, u'b'shnas Reish Yud Gimel. So after 212 years of fighting, that created Riv, Dafka Baalem Antiochus. So then that awakened the suffering for the sin of the sale of Yosef.
Is there some symbolism with Taf and Taryag and Remez to this? Because it's just tough in front of,
Interesting. Yeah, possibly. You could connect that. Okay.
You're talking about the sin of Yosef, but you're talking about the sin of selling Yosef.
Right, it's all connected.
But we just got through saying that was to purify him, that he was sold and it was the whole...
Right, but one shot doesn't take away from the other. In the end, they still hated him. And that hatred was still a sin, even if they end up doing what's right within the system of God. The whole thing, the sale of Yosef, we know God planned it. But still...
Once they came to Egypt, though, the whole family, was there still hatred?
Well, that's a question that really remains unresolved. Because if you look at the end, when Yaakov dies, the brothers come and they say, Yosef really does hate us. They never believed that he really forgave them. In fact, in the Torah, it never says that he says it wasn't your fault, it was this. He never actually says, I forgive you. And they say that that's the reason why the sin carries on. That is actually Yosef's fault for not saying the words, I forgive you, which is very necessary. Okay, so now he adds to this another layer, which this is an incredible pshat. He says, "V'gazar levata meham Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, Umila." What were the 3 things that the Greeks prohibited from us? Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Bris Milah. It doesn't make sense. Like Bris Milah, makes sense because that's the Greeks worshipped the human body, and they felt that was. The greatest corruption was to blemish the body. Shabbos, you could probably say, because I think most Gentiles recognize that Shabbos is such an outstanding aspect of. But the fact that it was Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, like what's the big deal about Rosh Chodesh?
That's a calendar.
Yeah, no, I get it, but it seems like such a minor detail within our Torah. I mean, for us it's a big deal, but from the outside, no. So they explain it is a bigger deal than we recognize. But still, we don't find in the future any enemies decreeing against our calendar. Usually they pick, some. So he says, right? Mipnei shekal eila shlosha mitzvos hayimechaper mal mechiras Yosef, because these are the three mitzvos which protect us from the sin of the sale of Yosef. HaShabbos k'mo she'amarnu, we talked about Shabbos before. HaRosh Chodesh she'makrivim bo sa'ir, the korban for Rosh Chodesh is a goat, a he-goat. V'isa bezoar Pinchas shu keneged Yosef, and that corresponds with Yosef. V'she'efshashu lechaper al seir izim sheshachtu b'mechiraso, because they shechted a goat and dipped the coat in the blood and brought it to Yosef, and so the he-goat represents the sale of Yosef. Furthermore, Hem Yud Beis Chadashim Meshana Keneg Yud Beis Shvatim, the 12 months correspond with the 12 tribes. So that's why the Sa'ir, the goat of Rosh Chodesh, is what brings together and atones for the breaking of the 12 brothers. Now you'll ask, but not all 12 brothers were part of the sin. But once some bring, everyone brings. With the korban, when the whole community sins, even though only some of the tribes sin, everyone brings a korban. Now you understand why sometimes there's 13 months, because Adar represents Yosef, Mazel Adar Dagim, V'yidgu la'arov b'kara ha'aretz. Yosef is compared to the fish, like fish within the land, and Ephraim and Manasseh are the two sons of Yosef. They sometimes consider tribes. Anyway, the point is, he's saying that Rosh Chodesh connects to the 12 brothers, with the goat being brought to atone for that part of the sale. V'amila Shazui midas hadavka shal Yosef. Now the bris milu, which represents the holiness and the kedusha of the bris, that's related to Yosef. And this will explain to you why he circumcises all the Egyptians. Because Yosef represents these three things: Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Bris Milah.
But how does the Greeks not like Rosh Chodesh? You went past real fast.
So they prohibited these three things: Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Milah, because these three things represent the fixing of the sale of Yosef. So therefore, because we're doing sinas chinam, they're coming against these mitzvahs. V'yadua, we're almost done here. V'yadua, we know. Shebekala mitzvahs aim behem rak shlosha sheyiu osos. Everyone knows this. There's three mitzvahs that are called os: Tefillin, Shabbos, and Milah. Ubishabbos v'yamim tovim ein anu manichin tefillin. On Shabbos and Yom Tov we don't have to wear tefillin. Sherei belavach yesh lanu shtei osos, because we have two signs on Shabbos or Yom Tov: the Shabbos and the bris. Then is Shabbos and Milah. Ukraksev, we have a verse which states, Al pishnayim edim yakum davar. You need two witnesses to uphold the matter. So the halacha is, you always need, every day, you need two witnesses of your connection to Hashem. So during the week, yesh lanu tefillin umilah. Ukashabat lahem Shabbos umilah. So when the Jews lost two of the signs, Shabbos and Bris Milah, Ainli Yisrael chas v'shalom el tefillin. All they had was the tefillin. Ve'eid echad ein moral klum, and one witness is not enough. L'chein kishabatlu mehem elu hamitzvos hayirotzin sheyichtavu al karen hashor. Therefore, they wanted to write on the horn of the ox that you have no portion in the God of Israel. The reason is because through prohibiting Shabbos and Milah, they've guaranteed that no Jew should ever have two signs. As Gavra Yadam Shal Yisrael, but the Jews overcame this. V'tiknu apegam, and they rectified the blemish. How did they rectify the blemish? By giving their lives for the observance of these mitzvahs. They fought for Shabbos, they fought for Rosh Chodesh, they fought for Bris Milah, even though they were banned. V'idliku neros, and then they lit the candles. V'nasa neis b'shemen, and the miracle happened with the oil. Why was there a miracle specifically with light? They already had a miracle that they won the war. Why was this miracle necessary? Especially since the Jews really gained very little by the fact that they got to light the menorah 8 days earlier than they could have. It's just a symbolic gesture. The answer is to show them that out of darkness comes the light. So he says the word ora, Aleph Vav Reish Hey, Begematria Reish Yud Beis is the numerical value of 212, which is the word Riv, which means the fight. Lirmos Shetiknu Mashapagma Beminya Riv, that their fighting, which they had fought with each other, which was the Sinas Chinam, through the process of the war, and eventually through the lighting of the menorah, somehow they rectified the internal fighting within each other, and they came together. And maybe that's why, according to this Zera Shimshon, this would explain, which I haven't seen anyone else explain, why Chanukah would become a time of togetherness, why there should be a celebration amongst people coming together. Where do we find anything in Chanukah? It's all about Hallel and Hodah and the lighting of the menorah, but there seems to be some general togetherness which we as a people have picked up, and it's not just because the world has their holidays. Chanukah has always been a time when Jews get together. So according to this, Chanukah is actually a time when we're supposed to try to correct the sinas chinam, the baseless hatred caused by the Jews, which is what aroused the sin of the sale of Yosef. And that's why we read these parshios at this time, in order to remind us that the reason why we had the trouble at the times of the Greeks were because we were bringing back up the sinas chinam, the baseless hatred. And we fixed that on some level, and that was represented by the word ora, light, which is the same numerical value as Reish Yud Beis Riv, which is quarreling, because we overcame one with the other. Eventually this would fall apart, because by the time you come back to the end of the Second Temple, we're once again all broken up into sects and groups and different places, and we're all dispersed and divided, and that's what brings back the destruction of the Second Temple. But at least at this time, in the time of Chanukah, the Jews came together, and on some level we fixed the sin of Yosef. May we merit that we too should merit the light through the observance of these mitzvahs, and we should rectify all the blemishes within the Jewish people.
Great.